Hello, Dr. Harrelson. This is my mom. We're going to be talking about September 11th, 2001. So the first question I have for you is, do you remember where you were when the Twin Towers fell?
Yes, I was at work in an office, and I got a phone call about it from a friend of mine about the first plane that hit the first building. And I stayed on the phone with her, and during that time that I was on the phone with her, the second plane hit.
Okay. Did you have any personal connections to anybody involved?
Yeah, we
in the
did
attack?
actually. So my cousin was a pilot at the time, and he was flying right behind the first plane that hit. And what ended up occurring after that was that obviously all planes were grounded in all airports in the whole country, and he got grounded at Newark Airport and couldn't leave for, I think it was about 7 or 8 days. I don't remember how long every flight was grounded, but I know it was quite a while, and I remember the skies being very, very quiet during that time. And he ended up obviously having to drive home. He lived in Maine, and he just after that had a very difficult time with it.
So he was in the air,
He was in the air,
like,
and
at the same time?
unfortunately his best friend was one of the pilots who flew into the towers.
Wow. Well, what was your initial reaction, like, I guess, when it happened?
To the whole thing, or about him? The whole
You
thing.
can answer both.
So my initial reaction was, I was pregnant at the time, so it was a very scary time. It's something that we had never I had never experienced anything similar in my lifetime, so it was a huge feeling of uneasiness and where is everyone? Like, where's my family?
Yeah.
And okay, what are we doing now? Kind of thing. It wasn't necessarily panic mode, but it was definitely, obviously by the time the second one hit, it was obvious that it was an attack and it wasn't a mistake. My first thought when the first one hit was it was a mistake, like there was pilot error, or something went wrong with the plane or whatever. But yeah, my initial reaction was, where's my family? Start calling people and finding out where people were, kind of thing. Yep.
Do you remember any changes in American perception directly after 9/11 towards any group of people, towards airports?
Yeah, so after 9/11, I mean, everything changed in airports, and everything changed as far as security. Everything changed as far as people would, I remember people just kind of just looking up, like waiting for the next months after. It was, the perception of planes had changed. They were now looked at as weapons, and there was this huge feeling of uneasiness, and we thought we were safe, and now we knew we weren't. And the fact that anyone could infiltrate, at that time what was thought of as, and still is, the greatest country on earth, was very unnerving, because we had this kind of we felt secure, and before it happened, and after it was difficult. But it was interesting to see how many people really came together, and there was a huge sense of unity within the country after 9/11. It was great to see, and it was horrible that it had to come because of that. but there was a huge sense of unity and just patriotism and people working together. A lot of that. I remember flags everywhere, memorials everywhere, just a lot of people really working together. Yeah, that's what we saw a lot.
So my follow-up question was, do you think that 9/11 broke Americans or brought them together, which you already answered?
I think that maybe for some people it broke them, but I think that the majority were really very unified. I think that unfortunately when something like that happens, it becomes it either sends you one way or the other way, and thankfully during that time the majority of Americans definitely came together. There was not a lot of divisiveness at all. It was very, very, very unified.
So this kind of ties into the other couple of questions, but do you remember what the day after was like?
Yeah, I remember the first 3 days after, actually, because when everything occurred, I actually left work. You were being babysat by someone, and I actually went to go see your dad first to make sure he was okay. He was at school, and they were dealing with all of the everything that was coming from that, from any students that had parents in the city. And then I went and picked you up, and I came home. I didn't go to work the next day, and I just remember being glued to the TV for the next 3 days. And I think part of that was just because at the time we really didn't have much social media, so that was the only way to get information. But the other part of it was I remember sitting there in amazement that this had actually happened, and like I couldn't pull myself away from it. So I think that people walked around kind of like just in stunned silence for a while. You know, it was so surprising. I think we thought that we were invincible, and it was obvious that we weren't. So I think that really rocked people. It certainly rocked us. You know, it was difficult.
Yeah. Do you remember life changing directly after as a result, or
Yes.
like just a couple of years after?
Definitely. Obviously, security in airports changed dramatically. As far as, you know, licenses and passports and all of that stuff, there was a ton more security with that. I remember people just kind of again in this stunned, I don't know how to explain it, this stunned walking around like, what just happened? And I think that it was difficult for them to really grasp it at times, even though we saw it, and we saw it play out in front of us.
So there were, it's kind of a silly question, but there were no 3-hour lines at Newark Airport before, like in security?
I mean, Newark Airport was never, you know, a fun place to be, but security definitely changed.
Because that's how I've grown up, like.
Correct.
With that,
I mean, we had
the norm.
security. It's not that it wasn't secure. It heightened it to 1,000,000 times more. And honestly, I feel like everyone at that point was looked at as a suspect because they had to be. They were, you know, they were trying to keep people safe. So that's just the way it had to be.
Yeah.
Unless you wanted it to happen again.
What did 9/11 represent for you? Like, how did you change personally? Did anything change?
I definitely thought twice about flying during that time period. Once I saw the security measures that were put in place, I didn't think about it as much. But that definitely changed that, and I think it also changed my perception of the United States as untouchable. It definitely changed that.
Yeah. this is definitely much later than 9/11. But do you remember the day that Osama bin Laden was killed? Do you remember
Yes.
like watching that on the news?
I remember seeing it on the news, and I remember it replaying a few times. I didn't certainly watch it as much as I did when 9/11 happened, but I remember it, yes.
Okay. That was a big event.
It was a big event. It because it was so much later on, I think that it lost a bit of its impact. Perhaps if it had happened closer to 9/11, it would have had more of an impact.
Like an emotional impact.
Yeah.
The emotions were less raw than they were.
Correct.
Directly after
right, because
the attack.
time had gone on, and people easily not forget, but people easily don't think about how difficult it was during that time period when you're however many years down the line. So.
My last question was, did you notice any changes reverting back to how it was before 9/11? Lack of unity, lack of patriotism, less flags flying.
That came later on. For a long time, there was a lot of patriotism. There was a lot of there's certainly a lot of unity. You had young men and women signing up to go into the Marines and the Navy and the Coast Guard and the Army and the Air Force because they were old enough and they experienced 9/11 in a way that they wanted to be there for their country and defend their country.
Yeah.
So there was a huge surge of that at that point, and I had never seen that before in my lifetime. So there was definitely that. As time went on, and as people who weren't maybe directly affected, like perhaps, people that weren't in the New York metro area or in Washington, D.C., it seemed to really lose its, like, this actually happened, this actually was not good, and just kind of more of forgetting.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much for doing this.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Harrelson.